Thanks, Father. A marvel of our church is Father Spitzer. Good morning to everybody. I want to start with a couple of words from Lumen Gentium. As most of you know, it was a document produced in Vatican II. If any of you have not read it, I recommend it. It's a relatively short document written in a fashion that lay people like me can read it and understand it. Part of it reads, "Now the laity are called in a special way to make the church present and operative in those places and circumstances where only through them can it become the salt of the earth. Thus, every layman, in virtue of the very gifts bestowed upon him, is at the same time a witness and a living instrument of the mission of the church itself, according to the measure of Christ's bestowal. Each individual layman must stand before the world as a witness to the resurrection and life of the Lord Jesus and a symbol of the living God. All the laity as a community, and each one, according to his ability, must nourish the world with spiritual fruits." I've been involved with the Napa Institute, as Father said from the beginning, and this is a lot of what it's all about. Being to the world what the soul is to the body. That's how Lumen Gentium, that passage ends. In a word, Christians must be to the world what the soul is to the body. So since we're in this world, I want us to talk about something about which we are confronted almost every day in our world. Profit, and what we ought to do with it. We all know the verse, "For what does it profit to the man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul?" Obviously, Christ was aware of the concept of profit, and wary of the way in which it might be obtained. But was he against profit itself, or instead being cautionary about how we might get it? And maybe more provocatively, was he in favor of man seeking profit as a means by which the common good and economic justice might be obtained? We all know he spoke approvingly of the servant who took the talents given to him by the master and multiplied them. And we also know that he disapproved of the man who buried his treasure rather than increase it. Did Jesus want us to seek profit? The concept of profit, I think, is actually not that complicated. We tend to think of profit as something only tied to money. But I think Jesus meant it much more broadly than that. That's because, in my opinion, profit is the benefit that results from a mixture of God's providence and the work done by a human being. The exact mixture of providence and work varies during our lives. Notably, and we also see this in other mammals, some animals thrive more than others. And sometimes this inequality of thriving is based on the amount of work done, but sometimes it just is. Some animals thrive more than others. Even among the animals, there's an inequality of profit. Human beings have a somewhat interesting characteristic, not shared by other animals, in that many of them keep working and end up providing more than they absolutely need for survival. And this additional work and innate ability creates even more inequality among individual human beings. Our biological reality is replete with inequality. Not every star has the same number of planets. Not every planet can sustain life. Out of millions of sperm, only one made me, and only one made you, and the rest failed. One sperm's work created a lot more wealth than all the others combined. Not every sperm achieves the same vitality. Not everyone can write an opera like Mozart, or a symphony like Beethoven, or paint a chapel like Michelangelo. So we see that in something as broad as our universe and something as intimate as brothers and sisters of the same parents, there's a plenitude of inequality throughout the world God gave us. We might even go so far as to say that God gave us inequality. But what should that mean for us? How should we deal with that? Is inequality a sin, a result of our fallenness, or a defining characteristic of our world as God designed it? In our society today, when we hear inequality, we typically think of it as something for which there must be a remedy. And if inequality is something to be remedied, a disease, if you will, then any cause of that disease, like, for example, profit, should be eliminated to prevent the disease, or at least restricted and redistributed. Cain didn't like the fact that Abel received an unequal measure of God's favor. It offended Cain's own perception of justice. It was an offense for which he felt murder was justified, not unlike so many Marxist and Jacobin warriors for justice. In the pursuit of equality, almost every type of violence has been committed since the Garden of Eden. We human beings seem to go crazy over inequality. We can't stand the idea that someone else may be getting more than us. It's not fair. How many times do we hear this said among brothers and sisters? And yet, even this reaction is based to some degree on biology. Biologically, when a litter of kittens is born, there may be more kittens than the mother can feed. And so the kittens struggle against one another for food from their mother. And sometimes one of them dies for lack of nourishment or goes through the rest of life as the run of the litter. But what if this inequality is a feature of the common good and not a bug? I don't know how many of you are aware of the phrase in software programming. The user of the software finds something that the program seems not to be working well, and he calls attention to the bug, the error in the software. And the developer says, no, you don't understand, it's not a bug, that's a feature of the program, right? The program works that way for greater good that cannot be achieved were it not there. It's not a bug or an error. As you might have guessed, that's how I want us to think about profit for a little bit, about the inequality of its distribution, but then what we do about that. It's not a bug in the system, but a feature as designed by God for some reasons we understand and other reasons that may remain a mystery. God favored Abel over Cain. God favored Abraham to make him the father of nations. God favored Joseph, and his brothers resented the inequality of it all. God favored John the Baptist. God favored Mary. And God gave Mozart the talent of an angel, and I struggle to play the violin. These things are called mysteries because we don't understand them. But regardless of whether we understand these mysteries, we still have to live with them and maybe even embrace them. Now, I want to be clear. I think God wants us to seek profit, but I'm not here today as an apologist for capitalism. I see, experience, and live among many terrible examples of greed and selfishness in the commercial world in which I'm engaged. I see lying, cheating, materialism, consumerism, shallowness, insincerity, and I could go on and on. But I've also seen that those sins are not unique to market economies. In fact, they're not even unique to the commercial world. I've witnessed almost all of those sins in every environment which I've found myself, including the church. I don't think the market economy and the pursuit of profit are without fault. I think they're teeming with fault. I think the world's teeming with fault. So we're not here to imagine that sin no longer existed. We're here to ask ourselves, given that we live in this fallen world in which the Lord has placed us, how might we organize our ways, our efforts in such a way that we might all grow closer to God and to one another in a relationship of love, of caritas? That's actually the whole purpose of our time here on earth. I believe if we all had equal ability, we would not have as much need for one another, and that inequality is thus a feature of the world God gave us and not a bug or an error. My thinking's similar to how we think of male and female. Their human dignity is equal in God's eyes, but their abilities are unequal, though complementary. Remember that passage from Lumen Gentium I read. We are to witness according to the measure that Christ bestowed. And so obviously, those who are especially blessed they simply must be mindful of how they might share those blessings. Profit is a good thing to seek when we're continually mindful of how it might be shared rather than preserved. I want you to think about the word preserve. We're going to come back to it. Karl Marx was an ideologue who sought to remake our human society in a way that comported with his version of how the world should be, rather than recognize the world as God established it. Marx denied the logos as the reason for who we are. He denied human nature. He saw alienation of the worker from his work, rather than from God, as the chief societal problem. St. Thomas More penned a famous essay called Utopia. That word utopia from Greek actually means nowhere. There's nowhere on earth that's now in Eden. Even in Eden, Adam and Eve sought to supplant God's judgment by determining that as good as Eden was, God must have been mistaken by forbidding the fruit from one particular tree. They felt they knew better than God how society ought to be organized, and so put him aside to institute their own intervention into the economy of Eden. Nevertheless, we must not gloss over or ignore the human failures of our market economies. We all now live in a materialistic, consumerist, Marxist world. And by Marxist, I mean we've all kind of come to define ourselves by what we consume and control, and by our status within society, even those who ostensibly support a free market. The non-believers deny human nature in their search for utopia. The socialists want to intervene in a way that stifles the creation of wealth, and that doesn't help anyone. But among the believers, we see what I think of as an inward-turning society of the mirror, where the comfortable, and most of us are comfortable, gaze at themselves and curate and preserve their lives. And yes, the selfie is indeed one of our mirrors of curation and preservation. This curation process produces a timid aversion to risk for ourselves and our families. And this sin echoes the servant who buried his talent. Let me tell you the disease I see among my peers in business. Having had success in creating profit, they seek to hold on to it more and more tightly, to preserve it. Having convinced themselves that all of their success is due to their own work, without accounting for providence, they seek to preserve the advantage that providence has provided to them by seeking protection of their status. And they do this by avoiding the risk of bountiful generosity and witness. Stated another way, we store up our grain in silos and ignore the responsibility God gave us to be good stewards for others. So what's the answer to this problem in which we find ourselves? The progressive disavows the market as a tool of alienation by those in power. And many on the free market side seek to hold too tightly to their gains so as to preserve their own wealth. The progressive is fundamentally wrong, but too many on the side of the market give an insufficient example of how one should respond to providential profit. Yes, you may have worked hard for what you have, but you wouldn't have it without providence. This combination of delusion and godlessness by the non-believer, combined with an uncertainty, a fear of uncertainty, I should say, not uncertainty, but a fear of uncertainty, and a doubt in God by the believers, leads to what we might think of as the prophylactic economy. The Marxists want to put up barriers to others having disproportionate success, and the bourgeoisie wants to erect barriers to preserve their disproportionate success. Rather than focus on putting out into the deep, as Christ commanded, both sides retreat in fear into protective silos of false community. By the word, while the word existential has become one of the most overused in our society today, this prophylactic economy is possibly the only crisis that's truly existential for the human race. The non-believers and believers have mostly stopped making babies. The ultimate profit of bringing another soul made in the image of God into this world is being forfeited every minute of every day by our modern world's failure to heed Jesus' command to put out into the deep. The non-believers feel that the power structures are so alienating that there's no use in bringing more life into the world. And the believers fear a dilution of their own career and wealth objectives if they have more children. And when they do have them, many times only have one or two in an attempt to focus more closely on the economic success of those few. We all know the real answer to the issue of caritas, commerce, and philanthropy, all of which are ingredients of our Catholic term, the common good. The real answer is to seek and love the Lord God with all of our hearts and minds and souls, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. But the world doesn't always listen to that. We don't always listen to that ourselves. I've been immersed in the commercial world for 45 years, and here's some economic observations I've observed during that time. Blessings are not distributed equally, and wealth is a form of economic blessing. But financial capital is just one form of wealth. We see human beings disproportionately blessed with the wealth of intelligence, beauty, good parents, stable cultures, physical strength, land, good health, children, education, and the list goes on and on and on, to the point that we almost have to conclude that this distribution in nature here on earth can never be made equal. The Soviets tried to equalize it for a while, but the process itself was a full-time endeavor, and they revealed the only way to create that equality was to enforce universal impoverishment, which impoverishment included spiritual death. That's how the Soviet Union made it equal. Envy is an element of human nature that's plagued humanity since Cain and Abel. Therefore, given that blessings have been unequal forever, society's got to account for how to manage the envy that arises from the inequality. I would argue if the efforts to increase wealth are promoted, not all envy and not all fighting will be eliminated, but much of the energy that would have been used on that fighting over a fixed pie can instead be used on the production of additional wealth. Now, that production of wealth can be very messy and difficult to control. But the consequences of that messiness pale in comparison to the troubles caused by war with one another when we want what the other has because of envy. Therefore, that society which desires the best conditions for the common good will promote the pursuit of wealth or profit. It will also promote an embrace of the reality that we all may be blessed more or less in different ways, but that those blessings can redound to the benefit of all. We should also, as a society, frown and discourage the expression of envy and resentment. But we should also vigorously encourage stewardship among those who are blessed. And we should also vigorously frown and discourage vain and immodest displays of status and wealth by those who possess them. Because if you look around the free economies of the world, the laborer has actually raised his standard of living at a much greater rate of improvement than the owner. There was a much larger discrepancy in the daily lives of the owner and the laborer 100 years ago than there is today. The laborers actually received the lion's share of the economic progress made in free markets. In the end, the laborer benefits more from the pursuit of profit than the owner. However, we got three significant enemies of the economic common good. We've got envy, but we also have timidity, and we have vanity. As I said, envy manifests itself in an attempt to stifle the creation of wealth. But I want to talk about those other two for a minute. Timidity manifests itself in hoarding and preservation by those who have achieved a level of material comfort. This desire to preserve, it kills caritas, and it kills stewardship. And vanity can manifest itself in all the affiliations and curated experiences that are collected to maintain status among one's peers. This combination of envy and timidity and vanity has led to what I earlier referred to as the prophylactic economy, an economy that's not pro-life. As to the timidity of those in material comfort, they're afraid of risk. They're afraid of losing what they have. They get used to their efforts in life producing success, and they forget the role providence had in that success. Accordingly, they become convinced that the only thing that can keep them in their own comfort is their own effort, and they grow increasingly further away from God with their own pride. I know this. I'm around them. I are one at times, right? I'm saddened and grieved at how many successful leaders in our society are 70 years old and have 3 or 4 children and have zero grandchildren. That's a new thing. They're so wealthy and preserved that their larger family has grown timid about life. So they seek to preserve and curate rather than create. Unfortunately, we don't have to worry about AI wiping out the human race. We're doing a great job of that ourselves through voluntary extinction. We have to be pro-life even though it's very untidy. 12 years ago, if you saw the house my wife and I live in on the day after Christmas, you would think it could be in a magazine. My wife has wonderful taste, and you see beautiful furnishings and Christmas decorations throughout. The day after this past Christmas, our house looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Because unlike 12 years ago, we now have 8 grandchildren. Thanks be to God, and God willing, our house will never again look like it used to look. Something is always broken or shattered. Someone almost always has a cold and needs to have their nose wiped. It is messy, messy, messy. It looks like we are not in control, and that is because we are not. And we're reminded of it every day. Growth and dynamism and profit is messy in a society. But without it, we become like so many small cities in Europe, which serve as nothing but historical museum settings for tourists to visit, with no baby carriages around, because the Italians and the French and the Spanish and the British are no longer investing in the greatest source of hope and profit in the universe, a baby. We need to encourage our brothers and sisters to seek profit by giving up their lives for others, as Father Rocky referenced. If they have a religious vocation, wonderful. But if not, they need to pour themselves into seeking marriage and having children. We don't tell them that enough. Society tells them the exact opposite, and we don't tell them what they need to hear enough. I promise you, I'm around them all the time. We don't tell them, even the believers. We think they'll figure it out, and they won't, and they're not. I can't imagine that there's a better environment ever created for planting and nurturing the caritas that we have to have for others, the unselfish caritas that we have to have for others, besides a loving family. Because otherwise, we increasingly turn inward, all of us. We become so timid and unbelieving, we take no real life-affirming risk. In chapter 17 of the Gospel, we read, Jesus said to his disciples, similarly, as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building. On the day when Lot left Sodom, fire and brimstone rained from the sky to destroy them all. So it will be on the day the Son of Man is revealed. A few verses later, Jesus said, remember the wife of Lot. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses it will save it. If you Google Lot's wife images, you get this, okay, in the desert. That's what Jesus warned about. That's Lot's wife. She looked back. She sought to preserve her life. Salt is the most universal preservative, and she became the preservative. a column of salt. She was trying to preserve, she was curating, maybe stopping to take a selfie. I got fascinated with this notion of Lot's wife, and I found she's also referenced in the book of Wisdom. In chapter 10, we read, where, as a testimony to its wickedness, even yet there remain a smoking desert, plants bearing fruit that never ripen, and the tomb of a disbelieving soul, a standing pillar of salt. When I read some of the obituaries in my local newspaper, I feel as if I'm at times reading descriptions of pillars of salt. Some of the obituaries are all about the bucket list of sensations that the person accumulated and curated. They sought to preserve their lives with the religion of the prophet Zuckerberg of the land of Facebook, who preaches that we can measure our meaning in life by how many likes we achieve with a life that has been curated. Zuckerberg will help you curate your life and preserve it. A curation is a collection, like a museum, of presentations that are carefully chosen and selected. And even those of us who are not on Facebook are subject to this temptation of the modern world. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Zuckerberg and our entire culture now say, I have been seen, and therefore I am. But Jesus said something different. You see, God planted in us a desire to love him and to be loved by him. But we don't always feel that love. So we seek cheap substitutes. We want to be seen so that we will know that our lives matter, so we will know that we're loved. But in seeking to be seen, we curate and preserve our lives, and we turn into pillars of salt. My hope is that we can all be seekers of profit. Again, profit's merely the benefit that results from a mixture of God's providence and the work done by a human being. God wants us to take risk for profit. Risk is a function of uncertainty, and God insists in this world he created on us having uncertainty. We cannot store up the daily manna that falls to the earth. We have to pray for our daily bread every day. That's how he designed it. He wanted uncertainty. And living with uncertainty requires faith and courage and humility. That's how we attack this whole psychological and sociological never-ending trap of envy and timidity and vanity, with faith and courage and humility. The following were all risk takers: Abraham, Moses, Noah, Joseph, Mary, Peter, Paul. They were all risk takers for profit. They all had to take a leap of faith. They all had to step out onto the water. They all had to put out into the deep. Thanks very much.